Today is Thursday, April 1st, 2021. And no, it's not an April Fool's. We actually do have a regular Board of Finance meeting this evening. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We're continuing our budget work that we've been engaged in over the last couple of weeks and have a number of topics to discuss today. So thank you to everyone for participating. We have a speaker tonight for public comment, Adele Coniff. She let me know that she wanted to address the board before we got started. So Adele, happy to have you. Thanks for coming, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I know Parks and Rec is not on your agenda for this evening, but I'd like to say a few words, and you can keep it in mind as you start your deliberations. Adele Coniff, RTM District 3, Parks and Recreation Committee. Dan Baumgartner and Pam Gary did an excellent job explaining the Parks and Recreation Department's 2021-2022 budget request. If you would like to see pictures of the cracks of the cherry lawn tennis courts, I know Patty Baumgartner has made them available to Dan and Rob, and I have pictures of the peeling paint on the Weed Beach courts. In addition, Lori Bora, Park and Rec Commission Chairman, Patty and I spoke at a Board of Selectmen budget meeting in support of the seasonal security patrol guard that is in the Park and Rec operating budget. I will not repeat all this information. I've been listening to your budget review and realize you'll soon be making your decisions. I cannot help but remembering last year with all its craziness and the 2020-2021 budget process. Nothing was easy, that was for sure, but particularly not for Parks and Recreation. In the RTM budget meeting, it felt like the Selectmen's budget was being pitted against the Board of Education's budget. We ended the process with $65,000 in our recurring capital accounts and $60,000 for work equipment reserve and $5,000 for tree replacement and $46,000 in our capital non-recurring budget. Darien residents have expressed interest that our beaches and their facilities, parks, playgrounds, and ball fields be maintained to a high standard. To that end, the Parks and Recreation Commission is currently working on standards of care in our parks, reviewing and setting standards for each park. The 2021-2022 Park and Rec capital improvement requests are intended to help maintain this high standard. Last year's Parks and Recreation's budget reduction makes it particularly important that this year's request be granted. Deferring projects ensure that the deferred items have deteriorated an additional year and can negatively affect the cost. With the change in the accounting criteria implemented this year for recurring capital items, the Park and Rec has lost the ability to save for future projects. What you see in this request is what the parks need now, and with the likelihood of a significant increase in indebtedness coming from the Board of Education in the next few years, deferred projects could easily be on hold indefinitely. I urge your support for the 2021-2022 Parks and Recreation operating and capital improvements budget request. Thank you.
Thank you, Adele, much appreciated. Thank you for coming. So duly noted. Is there anyone else who would like to speak before we get on with our agenda? I think it's just Jack on there. Jack, we see you. So let's go ahead and get started. So today we're covering protective and emergency services, excluding police, which we've already discussed, human services, general miscellaneous, other revenues, and fund balance. So for the non-police protective services, Paul and I worked on that. Paul, I can kick it off and you can add in if you'd like.
I have my numbers set in front of me.
Okay, well, if you'd like to start, go right ahead.
No, I'll defer to the chairman.
All right, so just to level set everybody, so these are for the 3 fire departments, Darien, Roden, and Roden Heights, includes the fire commission, fire marshal, hydrants and water mains, which is a big number, but not controversial because of the way it's managed. And then, of course, emergency management and EMS Post 53. So if you look at those total budgets for this year, they total $2,150,700, and that's up about 2.3% from the revised 2021 budget of $2,102,000. So a modest increase. It's puts and takes across the various departments. We're also going to take a quick look at the capital requests. They usually have quite a few items. This year, the total is $634,500. That is a fair bit higher than their proposed budget or the revised budget for this current fiscal year of 221,000. And we'll get into the main drivers of that shortly. So if you look at just the operating budgets, the first thing I'd say is that when you read through the descriptions for the coming year from all three fire departments, they talk about their volunteer staff, which appears to be robust across all three departments. They've also talked about their response time metrics and other statistics that they collect to measure efficiency of those departments. And when you read through it, it looks like they continue to do a good job. Obviously, false alarms and that sort of thing remain a driver of some of the time that they spend. But when you look at the responsiveness, it looks like even with COVID, they've been able to maintain those metrics, which is terrific. But all three departments, and I would say actually all of the emergency services, that really have done a terrific job in what has been a crazy year, just without precedent. And they've done a great job in terms of managing their assets, maintaining personnel, particularly the volunteer personnel, and then sticking with those statistics and their general effectiveness. So that's clear in all the write-ups that you see here, and I thought was clear from their presentations. In terms of the individual departments, I don't have too many comments in the sense that I would change any of their budgets. There were a few adjustments made at the selectman level, but nothing as I read through these descriptions that strikes me as warranting any kind of change or adjustment across all of them here. I'll let kind of Paul chime in if you had any specific comments just on the operating side, and then we can do capital next. Paul, what do you think?
For the fire departments, it was really relatively minor, and they were largely due to turnout gear. That's because new turnout gear has to be sized for new volunteers, and it only has a lifespan of 10 years. They're also replacing periodically their radios, and on the fire commission side, they had to have about $6,000 in professional services. In addition to testing their hoses periodically to comply with, I forget what the standards are. They now have to test the attachments to those hoses for proper operation and standard pressure tests. And the professional services in EMS went up $30,000 due to contractual nature with Stanford, and let's see, I have, and decrease in call volume and collections primarily due to COVID. That was forwarded to me by Jen. So.
Yeah, the other thing I would say is that their personnel levels and costs are also flat, and so no changes there. But other than that, I really don't have any other comments or suggested changes for their operating budget. Before we get to the capital side, does anybody have any questions? Okay, so on capital, the 634,000, there are just two big items in there. The first thing that I'd note, though, is that they had originally, or the Fire Commission had originally requested an $829,000 contribution to the vehicle reserve. Jim is going to get into the vehicle reserve when we talk about fund balance in a little bit, and we'll have more perspectives on that next week as well. But the Board of Selectmen cut that, and we'll talk more broadly about the strategy for those vehicles in a bit. But the two bigger items that are still in the capital budget are one is a new air bottle filling station at the Darien Fire Department. I remember looking at that thing 10 years ago and thought it needed to be replaced then. So apparently it's gotten to the point where they don't have replacement parts, and they do need to replace that. That's $75,000. And then also, I think we've talked about this before, this Opticon system that changes the lights so that emergency vehicles can get to the scene of a difficulty. That system's been in place, I guess, since the 90s sometime, maybe earlier.
Yeah.
And it simply needs to be replaced. And so that $300,000 is what's proposed to do that. The rest of the capital is what we see pretty much every year. It's regular radio replacement and sort of here and there changes in their capital stock, mostly what I would describe as small capital that you see here. So nothing jumped out at me as meriting any further change other than, of course, the change to the vehicle reserve. Paul, other comments?
No, the Opticon system, if people aren't familiar with it, if you look at an intersection with a light, it's like a little cylinder underneath it. And I don't know how it's transmitted, but the fire engine transmits and it turns the light green if it's red, so lets them through the intersection and speeds their way to the fire.
Now, clearly that capability needs to be installed in the vehicles of both current and former boards of finance chairmen. So let's make sure we note that carefully. Okay, but that was all I had on capital for the emergency and protective services. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, let's move on to the next topic, human services. I think that is going to be Taylor and Jim.
All right, I will kick it off. Starting with human services, this budget is, I mean, these are all pretty small budgets. It's $236,000, up a tiny little percent, 0.19%. The only real change here was the addition of a software program that they were advised to start using during, I guess, the tech assessment. The amazing thing about the human services budget is that they've been able to do so much with so little. It was reported in their budget package that they saw a 58% increase in demand for their services in the fourth quarter due to COVID. And the majority of their budget is actually for their staff. Only $18,000 is set aside for emergency and direct assistance. So the community in Darien really stepped up. And I think it's notable that the community provided over $13,000 in cash donations, over $10,000 in gift cards, home goods donations totaling an estimated 8,000 or more. And I guess 50 families and 50 seniors were adopted for the holidays by families here in Darien for an estimated value of over $15,000. So I just wanted to give a shout out to the community for that, because that was obviously a huge, huge contribution. And we hope that support will continue, because the impact of COVID is obviously far from over. And, you know, the financial recoveries that families will be working through will be, you know, sometimes long, and we've got mental health issues that'll be addressed. And in addition, I guess there are some clouds on the horizon with Husky Healthcare and food stamp programs being reduced, along with renters rebate amounts. So, you know, anybody listening out there, please continue to support our human services department, and thank you for everything you did. There are no reductions recommended for this budget by me. The senior center, their budget's $431,000. It's actually down a little bit. They remain at partial capacity. They don't have everybody back in the building yet, but the drive-through lunch program is going strong, and they have plans to move back to normal as soon as possible. My only comment about this budget would be that, you know, with over 1,800 members, it's obviously a huge success. But I do understand from some conversations that the programming is offered for free to all comers, those who are Darien residents and out-of-towners. And I'm curious to hear more about the rationale behind that lack of charging people from out of town, since our taxpayers are funding it. I do not recommend any reductions to this budget either. Youth services. The expenditure side of this budget is $369,000, and it's down 7% mostly due to program fees coming down. You know, they run our youth camps in the summer, and revenues are down 43% to $171,000. And I struggled with this at first, because I heard Pam on Tuesday talking about what an incredible amount of interest they've seen in Parks and Rec so far for summer programs. And I was curious as to why these numbers were down, and we were predicting lower participation rates. But after speaking today with Alicia, I found out that it's really capacity restrictions and cohorting that's going to force, you know, limitations on how many kids they can accommodate. So given that it's not a reflection of anticipated interest in the programs, but really what we can handle, it seems that this budget is just fine. Public health. The public health department's budget is $360,000 or $361,443. It is up slightly, about 3.97%. Small increase in headcount. And similar to before, I just want to say thank you to the health department. I mean, holy cow, they went from inspecting food service establishments and pools and sewage systems and nail salons to providing official COVID guidance to the town, the school system, and sports teams and everybody else, and operating vaccine clinics. So thank you guys. Great job. The budget next year is only up due to a small increase in part-time salaries and nursing hours that were due to new food regulations and COVID requirements. There really isn't a whole lot going on in this budget, so nothing is recommended there either. And I think that's it for the Human Services collection.
Terrific. Thank you, Taylor. Anyone have any questions for Taylor on this budget?
Yeah, I guess Taylor, or just maybe we just point out on the senior center, like sort of the program revenues are going to be up versus last year is what they're projecting, but certainly down versus what they were showing, sort of pre-COVID. And on the the meal program, that's showing to be up a little bit versus what it was sort of pre-COVID here. And I think the expectation was that so the meal aspect of it will continue to, should remain constant, but the program's going to have to sort of likely, kind of phase in and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they're not expecting to be fully back to normal, I don't think, before the fall. And I think, they're going to have to be very careful, obviously, due to the nature of the program. So I don't know, how quickly that it's all going to come back to normal.
Yeah. And then just a reminder for everybody on the senior transportation, that's, that is $52,000 there. There is sort of an offsetting revenue, which we see because from the grant. So that basically flushes that out dollar for dollar.
Thank you.
Okay. Next up for both of you as well, the general and miscellaneous budget. So employee benefits, risk management, contingency.
So, let me kick it off with contingency here. There's two pieces to the contingency here. There's the Board of Finance contingency aspect of it, and then there's a salary contingency that we keep in here. And this year the salary contingency is up, and that's because there are sort of two union contracts that will have to be sort of renegotiated and or settled in this year. So there's a certain reserve in that's anticipated to deal with any type of ultimate settlement there with the union. The other aspect is the Board of Finance operating contingency, which for many years it's around $400,000, and as you all recall, that's dollars that sort of sit underneath, that's appropriated dollars that sit underneath the Board of Finance control, which we all can appropriate to use for any kind of unexpected overages and throughout the year. Last year there was some discussion around that as we were all trying to sort of lower the budget and so forth to kind of bring taxes in, and ultimately you may recall we approved 400,000 and the RTM brought that down to 300,000. I think part of the rationale there was that they were looking at that $300,000 as a percentage of the Board of Selectmen's operating budget. What I would just tell everybody on this is that Board of Finance contingency is not just there to support the Board of Selectmen's operating budget of $30-odd million. It's also there to support and can be used to support the Board of Ed budget to the extent there are needs there, and to the extent the capital reserves aren't sufficient to deal with capital issues and so forth. I think if you look back over the last few years, you'll see that we haven't used as much of this contingency as has been appropriated. I think part of that, and Jen help me out here, is I think that the departments are doing a better job budgeting, and they're also, in terms of when new things come up, the department heads are all doing a very good job working inside their existing budgets and trying to find it, allocate it within their budget without coming to us. So, versus the 400,000 that we sort of had pre-COVID and so forth, and 300 last year, the Board of Selectmen, I think in light of the overall budget that we're looking at, thought to bring this down to 250,000 again, and that would be combined with the salary contingency that we have. And I think, my view is, although this is lower and although this is used to support both the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Ed budget if it's needed, the the Board of Ed has an additional grant. We've seen this year, to the extent they needed additional money, they can come back to us. And so I think we're okay with the 250,000. At least let's see how it works this year, and let's see if the department heads are able to continue to work within their budgets without coming to us.
Thanks, Jim. I'd further point out that a lot of times the use of that contingency is actually really is driven by requests that come to us, as opposed to a decision we're making to spend money. So it is very effective in helping us cover expenses that pop up normally with the Board of Selectmen, but could be Board of Education as well. So Jim's right. If you look at the historical charges to that account, having something like $250,000 should be perfectly adequate for this year. Let's see how it goes, but I would agree it's a useful tool and we should keep it.
Yeah, and I would point out that this isn't a reserve, it's a sort of an appropriation. So at the end of each year, these unused dollars flow back in the general fund and then would be appropriated the next year. So it is revisited each year.
Exactly.
So
Terrific.
in terms of other pieces of the general and miscellaneous, hold on one second. So we have employee benefits. And if you look at employee benefits right now, which is about $6.3 million, that's up 6% versus last year. And I think that's primarily due just to the increasing cost of employee benefits. It's in line with some of the increases that we've seen in past years. But if we compare that to at 6%, that line item's a little bit lower than what we're seeing on the Board of Ed side. And it really is what it is, and it's part of the contract.
Can I just add a little bit to that? The main driver on that is our pension and OPEB contributions, which we're budgeting the actuarially determined contribution. Our health insurance, I just want to brag that we are at a 0% increase for the second year in a row.
Got it. And on the pension increases, I think, Jen, when we look back at that, the increased contributions to our pensions that come from the from the pension boards, part of that was due to an increase in the actuarial cost of what those pensions will have to fund. Okay, part of it was remnants of a change in the discount rate, and part of it was, I would say, during the past fiscal year, what the performance has been in that fund. And I think that there was, if you look at certainly, following the markets, there was a sort of, period in that we saw sort of a downtick in the market. When we looked at the fund performance, I think, Jen, up through a month ago or 2 months ago, that sort of market value aspect of the decline has significantly recovered.
Yes.
So the market value aspect of it, I don't foresee, although I can't predict the markets, I don't foresee that being as big of an issue when we revisit this at the end of fiscal 21. Paul, anything from the pension board side that we should be thinking about those? Paul, you're on mute.
It's a smoothing function that's taken over several periods. So it is slow to correct and slow to take a downturn. So I believe, is it 5 years, Jennifer?
Right. Any gains and losses are recognized over 5 years. So even if we have huge market gains this year, we're only going to get 20% of that in our next valuation.
Okay. Any other comments or questions for the folks on these budgets for general miscellaneous?
Yeah.
Okay.
John, the last piece, which we didn't talk about, which is risk management, which primarily includes insurance and so forth. And that is in aggregate, I think that was down 1% versus last year. You know, there was slight increases and decreases if you were looking at different which component of that insurance, but overall is a $13,000 reduction versus versus last year.
Okay. Terrific. Shall we move on to other revenues? Taylor and Jim again.
So
Jim, are you going to share your screen? Oh,
yeah, I can't share it on my work computer here, but if kind
I
of,
might be able to share it.
okay. Well,
You want
as Taylor's bringing that up, if you look at sort of licensing and permitting, right, which is about $3.8 million of the total budget, there are two large components of that. The first one is town clerk revenue, right, and it's currently budgeted at about $1.6 million. Okay, and that's up from what we saw last year, which was budgeted at 1.52, which was down slightly from the year before, which was 1.6. I think based on, when we get to the fund balances and we start to go through that, you'll see that certainly this year we had additional town clerk revenues, just given the amount of housing activity and so forth.
Mhm.
That has picked up, but that number, in terms of budgeting revenues, that number is $80,000 higher than what we had last year. And I think, there was a lot of discussion around, should this be higher given the potential? Taylor, do you want to decrease that a little bit, the font size?
Oh, is it too big? Because I can barely see it. Let's see. You want me to like zoom out?
Yeah, just go to view.
Yeah. More?
That's probably good. So you can see in the top line there, the town clerk revenue, it's $1.6 million, down 80,000.
Mhm.
So, there was talk about whether that should be pushed up or not. I don't, it's obviously hard to predict how much long, whether or not housing activity will continue to be as high as we've seen it in the past 6 or 7 months. But that's one large component. The second one, Taylor, if you point to building permits, okay. So if you follow Taylor over to the left, you'll see the budget for 2020-21 was 1.8 million. That included what I call our run rate building activity of around 1.1 to 1.2 million per year, plus an additional $700,000 to $800,000 of permits associated with the very large projects going on in town. We've talked about this, I think, over the last couple of years, Jen, right? That these projects have had some delays, in part just due to permitting and construction and so forth. And then this year, in terms of things flowing for COVID, we have begun to collect some of those. And so when you look at what's budgeted this year, the 1.58, which is down 15% from last year, really what that number is a compilation of the kind of 1 to 1.2 of what we see in the annualized, plus about 2/3 of the permitting that we thought we were going to have in terms of the overall project. It's really the remaining 2/3. And this is, Jen, I think we've had contribution from the building department in terms of coming up with these numbers, correct?
yes, they actually develop them and then Kate reviews them and signs off on it.
So like we've seen in past years, and we'll see this year when we go through our fund balances, permit revenue is below what we expected, but it is occurring. So I think I think it's prudent to kind of keep this $1.5 million number in there, based on the pace that these other projects are taking.
Hey, Jim, while we're on building permits, I recall when we were looking at planning and zoning, looking at those revenues, and I think $57,000 of the building permit revenue in the next fiscal year was originally thought to be coming from, I'll call it the Palmer's project. And I think possibly when the budget was put together in the first quarter, that was a good number. But I think subsequent to when the budget was put together, it's been learned that that $57,000 probably doesn't start coming to us until fiscal '22. So, Jenna, just A, do I have that right? And B, should we be cautious about counting on all of this revenue, or maybe discounting it by that 50 to 60,000?
I think we should be cautious because that project has had a lot of rumors swirling around it. I'm just looking up exactly how much was put in for that one, just to confirm that. Yeah, it was 57.5. I think that probably is cautious. It gives us a whole year from now to collect that amount. So I think the number is already cautious. I don't think we have to be any more cautious.
I just kind of recall a conversation that suggested that the activity that generates building permit revenue is not anticipated by the owners to commence until July of '22. But
So-
if you're comfortable with the number, that's fine. But I was under the impression that we should probably not be counting on even that 57.
I had heard that we expect some activity at the site
Okay.
in the next few months.
Okay.
It won't be the bulk of the permit revenue, but I think if activity is expected to start in the next few months, we can assume some permit money comes in the next year. If we don't hit that 57, I don't think it's detrimental to us, so I would recommend leaving it in.
Thank you.
Okay, other points on revenues?
Some of these other ones we touched on, I think, when Dan brought us through the Parks and Rec, things like the beach permits, they're increasing, I think, the permit, Dan, by $5, and they're assuming that we're going to have incremental permits sold. So some of that all flows down into this 3.8 million of kind of projected revenues.
Yeah, Jim, they went up $5, and I think they thought they were going to sell, I don't know, 800 seems to ring in my head. I don't know, something like that.
Got it. And I think kind of going further down the spreadsheet and looking at the other sources of income, 3.8 million is what we discussed about all these different revenues. There's just under $500,000 projected from intergovernmental grants and so forth. The largest of that, right, 85% of that is from our ECS grant, which we have projected now basically flat to last year, which is 443,000, and that's down, if you remember, from a few years ago at $535,000. So I think the ECS grant is I think we're expecting that to remain stable. One thing I would point out that flows through that ECS grant, and when you see that move around in small dollars, is when the team at the Board of Ed submits their excess cost reimbursements, they're projecting everything out through the end of the school year. And then when they true it all up and they have the audit done, that's usually, kind of in the October, November timeframe. If they had to make some adjustments or recalibrate what was delivered and remeasure to a few kids, if they got a little bit more or a little bit less, if they got too much, it's actually deducted from our ECS grant when we get it back in April that following year. To frame that for you on a $443,000 grant, I think, Jen, that this year it was 13,000.
Yeah, we're expecting, I think, 12 or 13.
Yes, so it's minimal, and although that 12 or 13 is a little bit of our 440, it's very small relative to all the excess costs and so forth that the Board of Ed puts in there. So just know that there's a little bit of variability here, which is I describe as minuscule relative to what the Board of Ed actually submits. So that's the biggest piece of our intergovernmentals.
Jen, the only thing that I couldn't find anything about was the refuse tip fees. Do you have any insight on that?
That's a projection done by Public Works. We're actually running pretty low compared to budget this year. They're just not seeing the same volume coming through. So Ed does a projection based on what volume he expects to come through and bill out for tipping fees. So for next year, he's expecting a decrease.
Thanks.
Is Ed definitely taking the Palin household into account when calculating?
We good with the sharing? I'll stop.
And then I think, going on down, there's, we've talked a little bit about charges for services when we look at sort of park and rec fees and so forth. Right now, that's projected to be down 1% versus last year. There is a little bit of volatility in those numbers. Some of the bigger ones, beach parking permits, as we mentioned, are up. Park and rec fees are up. And, in terms of large dollar amounts, and then, the youth commission fees are off by, projected to be off by about 40%.
That was the camps I was talking about earlier.
Yep. And then, in terms of, lastly on the revenues here, I would just say, on the investment earnings side, we're projecting $125,000, which is flat to what we projected last year, and obviously down substantially from what we saw in years prior. And this is really just a result of the absolutely low reinvestment rates that we're able to obtain in the market. Really, that any municipality is able to obtain in the market. I'd let you know, having spent a lot of time talking to Joan about this and so forth, it's becoming increasingly difficult to kind of find short-term investments for municipalities. Generally speaking, when they deposit their money with a sort of larger commercial bank, it's actually punitive to the bank, where they need to hold greater reserves than you're actually depositing. So it actually costs them money to hold municipal money. So that's kind of adding to the the difficulties in finding short-term investments. But I think that's it, Taylor. On anything else I missed on revenues?
No, thank you.
Okay, thank you. If no other questions on that, let's move on to our last topic, which is fund to balance. Mr. Palin.
Okay. Well, so there are three different funds we're going to talk about tonight. One is the general fund, or sort of the largest fund that we hold. If you look at where we ended where we started fiscal year 2021 with about $25.5 million in that account. We had a special ed appropriation, if you recall, of just under 1.8 million, which brought the balance of that account down to 23.7. In terms of, you've been working with Jen to try to project where do we think we're going to be with the general fund at the end of this fiscal year on June 30th. And we're primarily focused on the unassigned balance in the general fund. That is, that's like the unrestricted cash that's in our general fund that we haven't otherwise dedicated or already appropriated to a certain project. There are three real areas where we expect to see additional money come in. On the revenue side, we're projecting a potential 1.6 million of additional revenue coming in. That's a compilation of taxes, additional tax revenues that we did not budget for. And if you break those down, it's a combination of slight changes to the grand list and changes to the actual collection rate that we assumed at the beginning of the year. If you recall, kind of going into last year's budget, we made a downward reduction in the actual collection rate to account for the fact that the significant stress we saw in the financial market. For the stress that we saw in the market. So, while we did see some of our residents and businesses deferring their taxes, ultimately collections, came back generally in line with what we've seen in past years. If you look at things like parks revenue, if you look at town clerk revenue, and then adjust downward for what we saw in building permits, all of that sort of came together to produce about an additional $1.6 million. In terms of Other items that we think we're going to end up with at the end of the year, right now, and again, these are all preliminary numbers. We're expecting approximately $800,000 surplus coming out of the Board of Selectmen budget. And then on the Board of Ed side, which, we talked about this a little bit on Tuesday night with Dr. Adley and Rich, they're projecting, an 800,000 odd surplus based on the 75% ECR reimbursement rate. And, based on the 80% rate or 80.5% rate, which the state is now guiding people towards, that would be just over $1 million surplus that the Board of Ed would have, which, given that they've committed to bringing that back to the fund, that would come back into the general fund. So we could be looking at, based on our projections, and we still have a few, 3 months left in the fiscal year, we could be looking at $27.1 million in our general fund, which, looking at just our aggregate budget right here could be around 17%. So as we begin to think towards Tuesday night in terms of how we're going to, the sources, if you will, to fund all the uses in next year's budget, this is one area that we should be looking at. And Jen's going to work to get sort of more updated numbers around to us over the weekend so that we have them or on Monday ahead of Tuesday's meeting. So any questions on the general fund, the unrestricted general fund balance?
And Jim, that percentage that you came up with, that's the fund balance as of June 30th projected with these puts and takes divided by next year's budget, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Well, I mean, again, it's a great analysis. I'd just point out to everybody that we have this 12% floor to that percentage that we adopted by policy a while back. So it's clear that we've got a fair bit of excess in the general fund balance right now. So that's definitely, as Jim says, something we'll talk about next week as we decide what the sources for meeting our budget needs will be next year.
So on the moving on to the reserve fund for capital and non-recurring expenses, right? This is otherwise known as like the Board of Finance Capital Contingency Fund. These are all appropriated dollars, right? That have either been the excesses of other projects and so forth that we keep in here to fund, basically off-cycle capital requests. And then generally at the end, at each year in connection with budget time, we've used some portion of this to fund the prior year's projects. Right now, that account has about $960,000 in it. Okay, and that includes, if you recall, I think it was 2 meetings ago, Jen, we appropriated a couple $100,000, or I should say we closed out project funds with almost $200,000 and moved them into that capital reserve. So that's about $960,000. If you look at additional projects and reserves that are on the town's balance sheet, that we think if we look forward to the end of this fiscal year, we think there'll be an additional $157,000 worth of funds available in those accounts at the end of the year. And those would typically be swept into this capital account. And then, there's sort of, there's another $60,000 of expenses that would come in, of funds that would come in connection with like an easement transfer. And then there's some upcoming requests we see are around $30,000. That would put that fund projected to be at about 1.1 million, just over 1.1 million at the end of our fiscal year. And again, I think if you look at where we've sort of held this capital account, at the end of each budget season going into the next to deal with sort of unexpected capital requests and so forth, that's generally been in the sort of $500,000 to $600,000 range. So there's some cash in there that we can also think about going into our Tuesday deliberations on the budget that we could use as a source. Any questions on the capital or the Board of Finance capital contingency account? Okay, and then the last contingency that sits on the town's balance sheet is we have, just under 1.8 in the fire department apparatus replacement reserve. Okay, and this, as you recall, we had historically contributed about $500,000 per year into this reserve. We did not contribute anything last year, and we did not contribute it this year. In terms of uses that are coming out of that fund, there is a fire truck in the works that would likely be purchased, later on this year. Expected cost on that would be around $1.3 million. So in terms of, either ending this year or beginning, fiscal year 2022, we'd expect to have a balance of around $480,000 excess in that account. And so as we begin to think about how we fund future fire trucks and so forth, whether that be bonding or out of cash reserves, this is an additional amount of money that we could look at to, potentially be used as a use to fund next year's capital projects. So I think in terms of, preparing for Tuesday, Jen's going to work to, try to shore up these numbers and look through all of the existing capital projects that we have and run through which ones we think are prudent to be bonded, and look to see if we can discuss, which of these 3 different funds we could use some of the excesses to pay for upcoming capital projects in next year's budget.
Hey, Jim, 2 questions. On the fire truck, if after we buy this, does anyone know when potentially the next one we would buy? Is it 2 years away, 5 years away, 6 years away?
I think we have 3 rescues scheduled for 2023. Let me double check that.
Yeah, that's right. Rescue 44, engine 32, and engine 23. That totals 2.5 million.
Thank you. And my other question is, the $1.9 trillion stimulus money obviously allocated a portion to Darien. Is that a post June 30th allocation of money to us? Does anybody know when potentially we're going to get that? I think it's 900 for the Board of Ed last time I heard the number, and a couple million for the town, I believe.
Yeah, I'm not sure the timing for the Board of Ed money. They would know that better. But for the town money, we're supposed to get 50% of it within 90 days of, I think, the passage. So, within the next couple months, we'll get 50% of it. The second 50% is supposed to be paid to us a year later. In terms of how that impacts our budget, there's a lot of I shouldn't say there's a lot of restrictions. There are few eligible acceptable uses of that money on the town side, and very little of it would actually support our town operations.
And in terms of that money coming in, will that sit in the general fund unrestricted, or will that have to sit in a grant fund?
I would put that in a grant fund.
Okay.
Quick question on our minimum threshold in the general fund. 12%, I think, is, so it's policy at 12%. Rating agencies have guided us to something maybe just lower, a little bit lower than that, but our policy's been 12. I saw a reference to a 15% kind of target. John, can you clarify kind of what is a policy and then maybe beyond policy is considered to be prudent practice?
Yeah, so we've had meetings with our bond counsel, who's given us a bit of an education on this. I think Jim sent around the presentation, or maybe Jennifer, that they delivered to us, that we went through it with those guys on. So the 15% number is closer to what you hear in terms of the number that they like to see. Our number at 12%, I think was developed in the sense that we're so strong on so many other dimensions that it gives us some leeway to have a lower fund balance than you might otherwise require. And the way I kind of look at it is you start with all these metrics, and it's interesting to look at this presentation. It is a highly quantified approach. In other words, they take each metric, each one has a weighting that they assign to it, and there's almost a mathematical output that guides them in terms of what's the appropriate rating. But if you rise above that, one of the kind of questions that I have with this entire process is that if you take a town like Darien that has our income base, employment base, property wealth base, all that stuff, And you have to ask yourself, under what circumstances would a town like this ever be downgraded, right? Like what would drive that? Would the fact that we had a 10% fund balance cause these guys to say, oh my God, we have to come in and downgrade them? When you look at the other sort of positive attributes that we have against the metrics that they publish for determining these ratings, I've never gotten a straight answer to that, or even an example of a town that's anywhere close to like us, where that kind of thing has happened. And so at one level, there's the mechanical process of this, and then the 12% policy we have, and the 15% general guidance that you refer to. Then there's the other element of this, which is kind of subjective in nature, which is under what circumstances would a town like this actually be downgraded? And what if fund balance was 8%? Would it really happen? I mean, there'd have to be a lot of other things going wrong for us to suffer that kind of downgrade. So in a general sense, I mean, subject to everybody's view, I remain comfortable with the policy that we have in place at 12% and think it's prudent. The fact that our fund balance number is higher right now, I think is more reflective of the environment rather than any kind of concerns on our part that a higher number is warranted. And following up on Jim's points, all three of these reserves, we're going to shuffle them around a little bit and use some of them to fund our budget for next year. And we'll get more into that next week once we've had a chance to finalize some analyses and working with Jennifer on that. I'd point out also that Jack Davis has submitted through his committee of F&B of the RTM several suggestions and write-ups in terms of how they like to think about it and what they recommend for our thinking. And a couple of that's kind of come over the transom pretty recently. So we're going to read through, everybody's got a copy of that Jack sent around. So we'll read through that collectively over the weekend and address those more fulsomely next week. But let me start talking. Jim, you were in the meeting with Mark and Jennifer. Maybe you guys could add to this.
Yeah, Dan, what I'd say is on the 15%, if you look at the Moody's methodology and you look at the matrices, how they score it, generally a 30% reserve or higher is considered AAA. A 15% to 30% is considered AA, and below 15% is single A. Now that all just goes into the pot, if you will, when developing overall rating. So we're obviously right now in the AA category as it relates to liquidity, and our reserves are lower as a percentage of our overall budget than the rest of the country. But that's something that we see across all of Connecticut, because the super majority of our, 90% of our taxes come from property taxes that we lie. We're not heavily dependent on, highly variable revenues or sales taxes or other types of issues and so forth. So the rating agencies are comfortable with it being lower. I think, the guidance we've gotten from our advisors is that 15% is where the agencies like to see it. But as we think about drawing it down, which we have, we've taken it down by $1.8 million this year, and we drew some down last year to use for the budget. It's also the rating agencies look at what are you using drawdowns and fund reserve for. If you do have excess, are you using them to fund one-off capital projects and so forth, or are you using them to fund operating budgets and so forth? So, that's something else they take into account. And then the other thing is, it's this, when you look in their methodology, right below the absolute percent of your fund balance as a percentage of your kind of budgeted revenues, budget expenses, if you will. It's the speed at which they're changing. Are they going up quickly or are they going down quickly? So I think, one of the things that we should discuss, on Tuesday when we're thinking about how we use this is, I think we should take that into consideration. I think dramatic moves one way or another are things that that the rating agencies would have concerns with. And as you look out, I think, Jen will be bonding probably $25 million, probably in Q3, early Q4. And then, in terms of things down the road, there's obviously, we'll see coming up in the next few months, there's a potential to see 3 projects at the elementary schools, each of which, could be around $25 million. So that could be an additional 75. So I do think, in terms of how we sort of manage the balance sheet, we should, keep in mind that, the amount of bonding that we have to do in the next, sort of 24 to potentially 36 months.
Also,
Well, clearly, go
other,
ahead.
other considerations would be our tax collection rate and the stability of that tax collection rate. Unfortunately, it also depends on what group of analysts at Moody's are doing the analysis. About a decade or two ago, I dealt with several of them, not on the municipal side, but give an example. About 10 years ago, they put a lot of the towns in Connecticut on watch because of Connecticut's exposure to the defense industry, which was kind of a mindless action relative to, I guess, submarine building up in New London and Pratt and Whitney, and industries with which Darien had very little to do with. So I would caution us not just to look at formulas, but to state our case as Jim has, as we are different.
Yeah, so what I wanted to make sure that the public understood is that we are in an excess reserve position,
Yeah.
and it's more of a judgment than a specific mathematical model determined by how much, but we are clearly in an excess reserve position.
Yes.
And I think the collection of explanation here has been really helpful. Thank you.
Well, part of it also was due to anticipated push down of teacher pensions from the state to the town, but I haven't heard that in the last year and a half, so I don't know how likely that is to develop.
And Jim, what's the guidance from the rating agencies on the debt, sort of the debt capacity, and because that has to be as important as the general fund balance.
Well, yeah, I think when they run like the debt per capita and debt per grand list type calculations, it would say that, from a rating agency standpoint, we could handle a lot more debt. I think the way that, we've traditionally been looking at this is, what does that debt cost us as a percentage of our overall, budget right here, and in connection with $158 million of anticipated budget, we're looking at about $10 million worth of debt service. So that's one of the things, and that's projected to decline going forward. Albeit we talked about having more debt come on, but from a debt perspective, we can handle more from a sheer quantum of debt. But I think the thing we need to manage is how much of our budget are we dedicating to debt service.
Yeah, thank you.
Jennifer, do you have any comments?
No, it's good hearing the conversation, and I'm getting a sense for how much of a drawn fund balance you as a board might want to do. So that's going to help me put together information to send out ahead of Tuesday's meeting.
Okay.
So terrific. I think we're in a good position on that.
All right, I see Mr. Davis has his hand up. Can we let him in?
I'm going to make this real quick. When you're talking about the fire engine, I think it's important to remember that the town only pays for 25% of that 1.3 million upon the order. And in 18 to 24 months, we pay the other 75%. And providing we're doing it within an 18-month period, that 1.3 million is more than capable of being bonded, if not this year, next year, and still be within the 18-month area. I also think, and I do recognize that last year 400,000 was used to pay, and there's been other payments out of the capital reserve. But it's one thing that F&B has been discussing is trying to determine an appropriate level, and that's what the analysis was. And that level is, at the high side, even 300,000, which is much different than the 5 to 6, because with the closeouts that happen consistently, which is averaging over 200,000, as well as the fact that it's rare that we even spend 250,000 out of that capital contingency, that at 300 with 200 gives more than enough coverage for the town to pay anything that's unforeseen coming up during the year. So I just wanted to add those points, and I appreciate if you look at it. And then one other little thing, on the second memo that I sent out in the first line about the DPW accrual, the word accrual was missing. So it's not that we're suggesting that the trucks, the standalone trucks be cut. We're suggesting that the accrual be eliminated on that as another option. So it says so at the bottom that we support the standalone trucks for 250, but the 164 accrual, we believe under the accounting consistency and the fact if we're not accruing for the fire engines, we don't accrue for public works, we don't accrue for Board of Ed, we don't accrue for police. We probably at this year could eliminate the 160 accrual and then revisit it during the summer if we need to.
Okay.
Thank you for the time.
No, thank you, Jack. And thank you also for those memos that you sent. We'll get through them this weekend and maybe ping you if we've got some questions before Tuesday.
Not a problem.
Thank you for that. Good deal. Okay, Jim, back to you. Anything else to cover this evening on fund balance?
That's it.
Okay, that takes us to the end of our topic list for this evening. Unless anyone has any other business or anything else to cover, Jennifer, have we missed anything?
Nope, that is all that I had on my list.
Okay. All right. So in terms of next steps, our next meeting is next week. It's going to be Tuesday, April 6th. And that's a regular Board of Finance meeting. And that's when we will do a final budget vote and set the mill rate. As we kind of just previewed, we'll be sorting through a few other options for paying for the budget that will include taking a closer look at some of these reserve accounts and including fund balance. So we'll get back to everybody over the weekend with some specific options that we might consider in that regard and copy you on that stuff, Jack, so that you can weigh in as well. But we'll address those next Tuesday night. In the meantime, if anybody has any questions on that, certainly reach out to Jim and Jen. They've done the lion's share of the work on all this. So if there are no other questions, then we'll see everybody next Tuesday. Can I get a motion to adjourn, please? Okay. Paul, second. There, Dan, thanks very much. All in favor? Okay, we stand adjourned. Thank you. Good evening.